Court records from the Oklahoma Territory tell of a woman whose name unsettled every plantation owner who heard it. Sarah Granger stood only a little over 5 feet tall, her hands appearing too delicate for the brutal cotton fields where she had spent most of her 32 years. Yet her presence carried a force that neither time nor terror could extinguish. Her story begins in northern Alabama, where she was born in 1824 on a tobacco plantation owned by Edmund Hartwell. Her mother's name never appeared in any ledger, her existence reduced to a numerical entry among the property lists. Hartwell was considered a reasonable man by his peers. He fed his workers adequately and punished them only when drunk. But even his mildness could not hide the cruelty inherent in the system he commanded. It was within this contradiction that Sarah grew up, learning to read in secret by watching Hartwell's daughter trace letters on a slate through a crack in the schoolroom wall. This act of defiance, small and dangerous, would later prove crucial to her survival. When Hartwell died in 1842, debts from gambling forced the sale of his estate. Sarah, then 18 and literate, fetched a high price at auction, $850, to a cotton trader named James Wickham. The sale tore her from her mother and 2 younger brothers, casting her westward into the harsh frontier of the Oklahoma Territory. The journey took 6 weeks, chained in a wagon with 11 others as the landscape shifted from Alabama's green hills to the unending prairies of the frontier. Oklahoma in those days was an unsettled land, officially Indian territory, but increasingly overrun by white settlers bringing with them the institutions of the South. It was a place of overlapping jurisdictions, Creek and Cherokee nations, federal troops, missionaries, and slaveholders, all coexisting uneasily under a sky that seemed too large for human order. Wickham's plantation lay 15 miles south of Fort Gibson, 300 acres of cotton and corn, worked by 42 enslaved people under the command of a brutal overseer named Walter Pewitt. Public whippings were weekly spectacles. Silence and submission were the only guarantees of survival. Sarah learned the rhythms of this world quickly: who could be trusted, which cabins were safest, when to speak and when to feign sleep. She also learned that Wickham visited the slave quarters on Tuesday nights when his wife Charlotte was away. The women in the cabins had a rule: when the master entered, they pretended not to see, not to hear, not to exist. 5 months after her arrival, in November of 1842, Wickham came to Sarah's cabin after dark. He carried no lamp, he knew his path well. The air smelled of whiskey and tobacco as he stood over her pallet. When he reached down to touch her, she whispered, "I'll kill you if you touch me again." Wickham laughed softly, amused by what he thought was an idle threat. His hand lingered on her throat, a reminder of ownership, but within seconds the balance of power shifted forever. From beneath her blanket, Sarah drew a cotton knife she had stolen from the gin house 2 weeks earlier. What followed was swift and precise. A flash of motion, a gasp, and Wickham stumbled backward, blood spreading across his clothes. Sarah walked calmly to the main house and knocked on the door. When Charlotte Wickham opened it, she handed over the bloodied knife and said, "Your husband tried to force himself on me. I've injured him. He'll need a doctor." Doctor? Theodore Gaines arrived before dawn. His report avoided explicit language, recording only severe trauma rendering future marital relations inadvisable. In private, he confided that the injury was surgical in precision, both testicles removed cleanly, the work of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Wickham survived, but his household changed. His wife continued playing the same nocturne on her piano, night after night, while Sarah sat on the porch, awaiting judgment. The trial that followed in Fort Gibson shocked the territory. By law, a slave who injured a master faced execution, yet Sarah's calm testimony and her immediate surrender complicated matters. Judge Samuel Breenidge, a man torn between legal duty and moral uncertainty, questioned her privately. She told him she had planned the injury deliberately, not out of rage, but to ensure Wickham could never harm another woman. The jury, 12 white men, deliberated for 7 hours and returned an impossible verdict: not guilty. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Preachers denounced the decision, and landowners raged that the system itself was collapsing. Yet Sarah Granger walked free, sold to a new master for a reduced price, her name already becoming a whispered legend. After her first trial, Sarah was sold to a man named Marcus Sheffield, a widower who owned a smaller farm 30 miles west of Fort Gibson. The sale price was $600, $250 less than Wickham had paid, reflecting what buyers called her diminished value and what others whispered was her dangerous reputation. Sheffield was considered a reasonable master, a man who attended church, paid attention to his crops, and believed he could control any woman under his roof. For 4 months, Sarah lived quietly on his land, doing her work without complaint, careful to avoid attention. But in that silence, she waited and observed, recognizing familiar patterns: the long glances, the excuses to keep her behind when others left the room, the careful testing of boundaries that always came before something worse. Late one night, when the house was still and the air heavy with the smell of rain, Sheffield came to her cabin. He told her not to be afraid, that he only wanted to talk. But Sarah had seen this scene before and knew what talk meant to men like him. When he reached for her, she moved with terrifying precision, a motion as fast and inevitable as instinct. This time she used a straight razor stolen from Sheffield's own shaving kit, hidden for weeks beneath her bedding. In one clean movement, she ended the threat. The blood that followed was silent and shocking. Sheffield survived, but not without losing the very part of himself that had driven his violence. The next morning, Sarah sat on the steps of the main house, hands folded, waiting. When the sheriff arrived, she surrendered without protest. The story spread like wildfire across the territory. Another master wounded, another jury forced to face a question they could not answer. At her second trial, the courthouse was packed. People traveled from miles away just to see the woman whose calm defiance made judges hesitate. When Sarah spoke in her own defense, her voice was steady, unshaken. She told the jury about being sold away from her mother, about Wickham's Tuesday night visits, about what it meant to live knowing a door could open at any moment and end your safety forever. "I thought," she said, "that once a man knew what I was capable of, he would choose differently. I was wrong about that." The prosecutor demanded to know if she felt remorse, and she answered simply, "I regret that it was necessary. I do not regret defending myself." Her words hung in the courtroom like thunder that refused to fade. After 11 hours of deliberation, the jury again returned a verdict of not guilty. The decision shocked the territory, angered plantation owners, and turned Sarah into both a symbol and a threat. Sheffield, humiliated and physically ruined, sold her the same week for $420. Her new master was Elias Drummond, a cotton gin operator who prided himself on being progressive. He allowed his enslaved workers to marry, gave them small gardens, and convinced himself he was better than the rest. For 9 months, Sarah worked under his watchful eye, waiting, enduring, and once again learning the rhythm of his behavior. When the night finally came, it was no surprise. He came to her quarters under the same pretext as the others, drunk with the same sense of entitlement. Sarah met him with the same precision that had already made her name legend. Using a paring knife from the kitchen, she cut him cleanly, efficiently, almost surgically. Dr. Gaines, called once more to treat the injury, wrote in his private notes that her understanding of anatomy was remarkable, as though she had studied medicine. When she stood trial for the 3rd time, the story had already spread far beyond Oklahoma. Newspapers in Boston called her an avenger, while Southern editors demanded her execution. Crowds gathered for days outside the courthouse. Inside, Sarah sat with the same composure she had always shown, her scar catching the light like a mark of defiance. Despite the outrage, despite the evidence, the jury returned the same verdict once more: innocent. When the verdict was read, silence filled the courtroom. Drummond, shamed but alive, did not seek revenge. Instead, he freed her, signing manumission papers that granted her liberty and paid her $75 in wages. Sarah left Oklahoma for Fort Smith, Arkansas, where she lived quietly for 3 years, working as a seamstress, attending evening reading classes, and writing letters. For the first time in her life she was free, but freedom came with the ghosts of everything she had endured. People told stories about her. Some called her monster, others martyr. But Sarah herself stayed silent, letting the legend of what she had done grow on its own. In the stillness of her small rented room above a dry goods store, she stitched fabric by day and thought about what it meant to survive by night. A woman who had fought her way through the laws of men and come out the other side, scarred but unbroken. She might have lived quietly forever in Fort Smith, but peace was never something the world allowed Sarah Granger to keep. In May of 1854, 3 years after her freedom, she walked back across the border into Indian Territory and returned to Fort Gibson, not to face another charge, but to speak for someone else. The woman was named Hannah, 19 years old, accused of striking her master with a fire poker after he forced his way into her cabin. The man survived with a broken collarbone, and as always, his word weighed heavier than hers. The courtroom was already filled when Sarah entered, her presence causing whispers that rippled through the crowd like wind across a field. Everyone knew who she was. Her name carried the weight of 3 impossible acquittals. Judge Breenage, now older and worn from years of impossible cases, hesitated to let her testify. She hadn't witnessed the attack, and she wasn't legally involved, but Sarah had come prepared. She brought letters, dozens of them, written by women across several territories, detailing assaults, punishments, and the few rare moments when someone had fought back and lived. She had gathered them quietly during her years in Fort Smith, building a secret network of voices that proved Hannah's story was not an isolated event but part of something much larger. When the judge read those letters in his chambers, he saw the pattern clearly. The same nights, the same excuses, the same kind of violence repeated in different places under different names. Against every rule and every precedent, he decided to let Sarah speak. For 3 days, she testified not about one woman's actions, but about a system that made such actions inevitable. She described how the assaults always happened at night when no witnesses could safely intervene, how the women had learned to feign sleep, how communities created warning signals, a cough, a scrape, a whispered word, to buy a few seconds of protection. She spoke about anatomy, about why she'd chosen injuries that made it impossible for her attackers to repeat their crimes, explaining calmly that precision, not rage, was what kept her alive. The prosecutor tried to twist her words, accusing her of premeditated violence, of training others to attack, but Sarah answered evenly, "I prepared for the possibility of needing to defend myself. That's not the same as planning an attack." Her words broke through the courtroom's pretense of moral superiority. When the verdict came after 19 hours, Hannah was acquitted. Sarah's testimony didn't just free one woman, it ignited something far larger. Within weeks, others began seeking her out, traveling miles at night to find her. They came frightened, bruised, desperate for advice, asking what the law would do if they ever had to defend themselves. Sarah never told them to fight, never encouraged violence, but she taught them what she knew: how to protect their bodies, how to wound without killing, how to explain self-defense in terms a jury might understand. She drew simple diagrams in the dirt, teaching where strength and vulnerability met. Her words spread quietly, woman to woman, until whispers turned into knowledge and knowledge into action. Between 1854 and 1856, 9 more cases appeared across Oklahoma and Arkansas territories, women who fought back and left their masters alive but permanently changed. The white landowners panicked. The pattern was too precise to ignore. They claimed it was rebellion, a coordinated uprising of women. 20, 3 plantation owners formed what they called the Territorial Property Protection Committee and hired a Richmond lawyer named Cornelius Vance, famous for crushing slave revolts. His task was simple: find a way to destroy Sarah Granger legally. He couldn't retry her for the assaults. Double jeopardy protected her, and she was now a free woman beyond the laws that governed the enslaved. But Vance found an old English statute buried in colonial law: conspiracy to commit mayhem. It didn't require proof of direct violence, only evidence that she had provided knowledge or encouragement that led to injury. It was a weapon crafted out of technicalities, but it was enough. In August 1856, Sarah Granger was arrested again, not for what she had done, but for what she had taught. The trial was unlike anything the territory had ever seen. 17 witnesses testified: injured masters, overseers, even one terrified woman who claimed Sarah had shown her where to cut. The courtroom overflowed with onlookers. Federal marshals stood guard against riots. Judge Breenidge, frail and visibly ill, presided with shaking hands. The prosecution painted Sarah as a mastermind of organized resistance, a teacher of mutilation, a threat to civilization itself. But when her defense began, the narrative shifted. Her young lawyer, Robert Chenoweth, argued that teaching self-defense was not conspiracy but survival. He spoke for 2 hours, his voice steady and clear. They call it rebellion. He said, but it is only education. Sarah Granger didn't create violence. She named it, recorded it, and showed others how to live through it. During the trial, marshals searched her room in Fort Gibson and found something that terrified the prosecution even more than her words: 47 letters, 6 journals, and meticulous records of attacks, court outcomes, and legal arguments from across 5 territories. It was a complete archive of resistance. Vance held them up before the jury, calling them evidence of a plot. But to others, they looked like proof of truth. For 4 tense days, the jury deliberated as Fort Gibson held its breath. When they finally returned, the foreman's voice trembled. Not guilty. Yet their written statement went further than any verdict before it. We cannot criminalize the act of teaching women to protect themselves. The fault lies not in the defense, but in the system that makes it necessary. It was the first time a jury had ever said such words aloud in Oklahoma territory. Sarah stood silent as the room erupted around her, her face unreadable, knowing that the decision had changed everything, not because it set her free, but because it made her unstoppable. After the verdict that should have ended everything, Sarah Granger returned to Fort Gibson a free woman once again, but freedom had become something complicated, half peace and half shadow. The trial had made her name both feared and sacred. Women came to her in secret, sometimes under cover of darkness, carrying questions wrapped in fear. How to stay alive, how to make their stories matter if the worst happened. Sarah no longer moved like someone waiting for danger. She moved like someone expecting it. She lived quietly, working as a seamstress by day and writing by lamplight at night. The archive she had begun, the letters, journals, and testimonies, grew thicker each month, spreading through a network of hands she trusted. She knew it was only a matter of time before someone tried to silence her again, so she prepared. Copies of her records were hidden in churches, in private homes, even in the Creek Nation archives under the care of sympathetic tribal delegates. She had learned that survival wasn't only about the body, it was about the memory of what happened to it. The white landowners didn't rest. The Territorial Property Protection Committee saw her acquittal as a humiliation that needed correction. They called her a corrupter, claiming she was spreading poison through the minds of women. Cornelius Vance, the Richmond lawyer who had failed to convict her, searched for another way. He found it not in violence, but in bureaucracy. If she couldn't be executed or enslaved, she could be buried under the weight of federal law. In December 1857, 2 marshals arrived at her small rented room in Fort Gibson with new charges: mail fraud. It was absurd on its face, claiming she had used the postal system to circulate subversive material, and endanger public order. Everyone understood it was an excuse, but it was enough for an arrest. They took her without struggle. As she was led through the streets, the people who once whispered her name in fear now watched in silence, unsure whether they were witnessing an ending or the beginning of something even larger. The trial was brief and cold, held before Judge William Patterson, who lacked both Breenage's compassion and his patience for moral nuance. He made his position clear from the start. This case would not become another debate about slavery or justice. The only question, he said, was whether Sarah Granger had violated federal postal regulations. The proceedings lasted 2 days. There were no long defenses, no dramatic speeches, just paperwork, accusations, and silence. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before finding her guilty. Patterson sentenced her to 18 months in federal detention at Fort Leavenworth, followed by permanent exile from the territory. Sarah listened without reaction, as though she had expected every word. When the guards took her from the courtroom, she turned once to the gallery and said, "They can exile one woman, they cannot exile the knowledge I've shared." Fort Leavenworth in 1858 was less a prison than a stone cage built for exhaustion. The women's section had once been a storage house, 3 long rooms of limestone, damp in winter and suffocating in summer. The walls sweated moisture that soaked everything inside. 17 women lived there, their crimes ranging from theft to murder. Sarah was assigned to the laundry, scrubbing soldiers' uniforms until her hands cracked and bled. The guards were not cruel by intention, only by habit, enforcing rules that left no room for mercy. Silence during work hours, single file movement, no physical contact, no missed prayers. The chaplain spoke often of repentance and divine justice, though he never met anyone's eyes while doing it. Sarah adapted with the same calm precision that had carried her through everything else. She followed every order, caused no disturbance, and kept her mind sharp by observing. The other women knew who she was. Some had read her name in newspapers, others only through rumor, but all felt the quiet gravity she carried. They began to seek her advice, not about revenge or escape, but about endurance. She told them how to survive without losing themselves, how to record what they saw even if no one would read it. Write letters, she said softly one night. Even if they never leave this place, the only power we have is to be remembered correctly. What the prison authorities never realized was that Sarah had already prepared for this final act of punishment. Before her arrest, she had finished transferring all her documents to safety and trained 3 women to continue her work. They knew how to copy, to hide, to preserve. The archive no longer depended on her. Her imprisonment was supposed to erase her, but instead it gave her time to think. In the stillness of Fort Leavenworth, she began writing letters again, this time more reflective than ever before. She wrote about the difference between resistance and freedom, about the cost of survival and the question of what came after it. Perhaps, she wrote to a friend, "I've become too focused on defending life to imagine how to live it." Yet even in that place of stone and silence, her words escaped through secret channels. Smuggled letters, coded messages, whispered retellings, all carried the same message: the work continues. Outside the prison walls, her influence hadn't faded. In towns and plantations across the territories, women still whispered her name, passing down the techniques she had taught, the stories she had documented. For them, her captivity was not an ending but a transformation, from a living woman into something uncontainable, an idea that could not be shackled. Inside Leavenworth, Sarah watched the light move across the floor each day, marking time not by the calendar but by the rhythm of sunlight on stone. Her hands remained scarred, her body weakened, but her will stayed untouched. Even in confinement, she was still the same woman who had once stood before a judge and turned the meaning of justice upside down. The prison could silence her voice, but not the echo of what she had already taught the world. Winter at Fort Leavenworth came like punishment itself, creeping through the stone walls until the air inside was as cold as the wind outside. Sarah's body, already worn from months of labor, began to give way under the strain. The constant dampness infected her lungs, The endless washing burned her skin raw. Yet she refused to appear weak, keeping her movements precise and her voice steady, even as her cough deepened into something that rattled through her chest. The guards hardly noticed. Sickness was common, and attention was rare. Only Mrs. Hale, the matron of the women's ward, watched her with quiet concern. She saw how Sarah's hands trembled when she lifted the heavy buckets, how she turned her head to hide the blood she coughed into a rag. But rules were rules, no special treatment, no exceptions. When Sarah could no longer stand through an entire workday, Hale finally called for the prison doctor. His diagnosis was simple and cruel: pneumonia. He ordered her moved to the infirmary, a narrow room with 6 beds and barely enough air to breathe. The doctor asked for better food and warmer blankets, but the commandant refused, saying the government's duty was to confine her safely, not to make her comfortable. In that dim infirmary, surrounded by women dying of tuberculosis and unnamed fevers, Sarah began her slow decline. Some days she was lucid, able to speak softly to the others, telling them stories to keep their minds from breaking. Other days, she drifted in and out of fevered dreams. She saw her mother's face, though she'd never known it clearly, saw her brothers as children, saw the cotton fields under the burning Alabama sun. In her delirium, she returned to the courtroom, to the faces of men who couldn't decide whether to fear her or admire her. She dreamed of the women she had taught, of letters written in careful secret, of the network she had built spreading quietly like roots beneath the ground. Sometimes she whispered to herself, "The work continues," as if reminding the world not to forget. The chaplain came often, preaching repentance and salvation, telling her that submission to suffering brought peace. She listened once, then asked him in a fading voice if he'd ever been a woman waiting in the dark for footsteps she didn't want to hear. When he couldn't answer, she turned her face to the wall and never spoke to him again. By late November, her strength was gone. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her fever rising and falling like the tide. The doctor visited daily, helpless to do more than offer laudanum for the pain. On a cold morning in December, Sarah asked for paper and ink. The matron hesitated, but something in Sarah's calm convinced her. She wrote 3 letters that day, her hands shaking so badly she had to pause every few lines. The first was to her friends in Fort Gibson, thanking them for keeping her story alive and urging them to continue. The second was to the 3 women she had trained, reminding them to preserve the archives and expand the network, to keep hiding copies in places where no law could reach. Third was addressed to Judge Breenage's daughter in Philadelphia, who had joined the abolitionist movement after her father's death. In that final letter, Sarah wrote, "Your father understood that law without justice is only organized violence. He saw humanity where others saw property. Tell your children he chose conscience over comfort. That deserves to be remembered." When she finished, she sealed the letters and gave them to Mrs. Hale, who promised to send them. No one knows if she did, but years later, copies appeared in archives across the country. The fever returned that night, worse than before. Her breathing grew ragged, her eyes unfocused. The doctor came once more, increasing her dose of laudanum to ease her pain. Just before dawn on December 3, 1858, Sarah Granger died, her lips forming the same words she had whispered for years: "The work continues." She was 34 years old. Her body was buried that afternoon in the prison cemetery, an unmarked grave among dozens of others, marked only by a wooden stake that read 1858-117. There was no family, no friends, only a short service led by the same chaplain who had never known what to say to her. In his journal, he wrote that she had died unrepentant, but without bitterness. Mrs. Hale, standing at the edge of the burial, later wrote to her sister that she had seen many women break in that place, but Sarah Granger remained herself until the end, and she could not decide whether that made her story tragic or triumphant. 2 weeks later, word of her death reached Oklahoma Territory. The newspaper printed it as a single line in the deaths column: Sarah Granger, convicted of mail fraud, deceased at Fort Leavenworth, December 3rd. It was meant to be an ending, an administrative note, but among the women she had helped, the news spread differently. They didn't mourn her in silence. They whispered her name like a promise, not as a saint or a monster, but as proof that resistance could outlive the body. In the letters that traveled through hidden hands that winter, one phrase appeared again and again: "She did not die. The work continues." News of Sarah Granger's death moved slowly across the territory, carried not by official channels but by whispers, by letters passed hand to hand, by quiet conversations between women who understood what her life had meant. To the white authorities and plantation owners, her passing brought a sense of relief, though none dared speak it aloud. They believed the threat had finally ended, that the strange infection of defiance she had spread through the enslaved population would fade now that its source was gone. But they were wrong. Her death did not silence her story, it multiplied it. The archive she had built became something greater than paper and ink. It became memory shared across miles. The three women she had trained took it upon themselves to continue her work, each in different towns, each risking everything. They wrote letters under false names, copied court transcripts in secret, and gathered testimonies from women who had fought back. One of them, Elizabeth, wrote in her journal 3 days after hearing the news, "They could bury her body, but they cannot bury the truth she planted. It grows beneath every field they think they own." In the 18 months after Sarah's death, her network expanded farther than it ever had while she lived. New letters began to appear from Missouri, Arkansas, even Tennessee. Stories of resistance, of trials, of small victories in courtrooms where women invoked self-defense against impossible odds. Each letter followed Sarah's method, dates carefully recorded, facts stated without emotion, written not as confession but as evidence. The archive became a living thing, passed between churches, schools, and private homes. Ministers' wives and teachers hid the documents under floorboards or behind false panels in trunks. Some of them had never met an enslaved woman, but they understood what Sarah had taught, that silence served the oppressor better than chains ever could. The authorities, predictably, struck back. In April 1859, postal inspectors in Arkansas intercepted a packet of letters addressed to a church in Little Rock. Inside were detailed accounts of assaults and retaliations, copied testimonies, and even diagrams of self-defense injuries. 5 women were arrested on charges of conspiracy and seditious correspondence. Their trial became a spectacle, the prosecutor calling them disciples of Sarah Granger. But what the state intended as condemnation became revelation. The defense introduced the intercepted letters into the court record, forcing newspapers to print them in full. Readers who came for scandal found themselves confronted with the raw truth of what life under slavery required from its victims. The women were convicted, but the sentence was light: 6 months in a county jail, time counted from arrest. Even the judge admitted that the law had failed to answer the deeper questions their actions raised. He ended his ruling by saying, "Perhaps the greater crime lies in what makes such acts necessary." Across the territory, that sentence lingered longer than the trial itself. The courts had begun to absorb what Sarah's life had already proved, that law without justice was hollow. Over the next few years, at least a dozen trials involving enslaved people who injured their masters referenced territorial precedent. In cases of self-defense, though none dared use Sarah's name in writing, her influence lived between the lines, shaping decisions without acknowledgement. Judges who had once quoted scripture about obedience now spoke cautiously about mitigating circumstances and provocation. Defense attorneys quietly invoked the principles she had embodied, turning her defiance into legal language that could slip through the cracks of an unjust system. Meanwhile, her writings survived in unexpected places. Some were hidden in church basements in Fort Gibson and Tahlequah. others in Creek Nation archives where tribal historians preserved them as part of their own struggle against erasure. One Presbyterian minister discovered a trunk of her letters in a false compartment beneath his pulpit years after the war. In a letter he later sent to a seminary in Ohio, he wrote, "These papers make me uncomfortable. They reveal what we all knew but refused to face, that the system was violence disguised as law." He cataloged them carefully, unwilling to destroy what truth demanded to survive. By the late 1850s and early 1860s, the country itself began to fracture along the same moral lines Sarah's trials had exposed. As war drew near, the territories filled with rumors of rebellion, of secret networks arming for freedom. When Union forces finally entered Oklahoma Territory in 1863, they found communities of formerly enslaved people who were astonishingly organized, carrying with them records of their families, their ownership histories, even their own legal petitions prepared in advance. A Union officer wrote in his report, "The freed population here demonstrates a peculiar sophistication in matters of law. They seem to have been preparing for this moment long before our arrival." What he witnessed was not coincidence but the living legacy of Sarah Granger. The knowledge she had passed down, how to document, how to record, how to survive, had outlived her body by years. The men she had injured remained silent ghosts in the story. Wickham fled Oklahoma, living out his life in New Orleans alone and broken. Sheffield stayed and became a politician, preaching moderation but never naming the reason for his caution. Drummond, the only one who had freed her willingly, turned into an advocate for abolition, his speeches haunted by the memory of the woman who had forced him to see the world differently. They each carried her mark, literal or otherwise, a reminder that violence could be answered by something sharper than fear. In every plantation and every courthouse where women whispered her name, Sarah Granger had become less a person and more an idea, the proof that knowledge, once shared, could never be contained again. Her grave might have been unmarked, her death barely recorded, but the movement she created had already slipped beyond the reach of those who thought they owned her story. What began as one woman's act of defiance had turned into a map, guiding others through a world built to erase them. Long before anyone dared to say it aloud, her legacy had already rewritten the meaning of survival. For nearly 20 years after her death, Sarah Granger's name faded into the margins of history, surviving only in whispers and unsigned letters passed among women who refused to let her memory die. The Civil War came and went, bringing both liberation and new kinds of struggle. Reconstruction raised promises that soon collapsed under the weight of old hatred. Yet even in those years of confusion, traces of Sarah's work continued to surface, small references in court records, unsigned documents written in the same measured hand, and testimonies from freedwomen who could recite her teachings word for word. Her name became a kind of code, spoken carefully and never written where it could be used against them. When women met in secret to read or to write, they often began their gatherings with the phrase, "The work continues," unaware that they were repeating the last words she had ever spoken. In 1875, a young historian named Lillian Kramer stumbled upon a bundle of documents in the attic of an abandoned mission school near Fort Gibson. The papers were wrapped in oilcloth, still faintly smelling of smoke and dust. Inside, she found letters written in different hands, all signed with the same initials S.G. At first she assumed they belonged to a missionary, perhaps a teacher. But as she read further, she realized the letters chronicled the lives of enslaved women, their abuse, their resistance, their trials. Some spoke of Sarah Granger by name, others simply called her the woman who taught us. Kramer was struck by the clarity of the language. There was no bitterness, no plea for pity, only precise records of pain and survival. She spent weeks cataloging the papers, not yet understanding that she had uncovered the earliest organized documentation of women's resistance in the American South. When Kramer tried to publish her findings, she met walls of silence. Editors refused her manuscripts, calling them unsuitable or too inflammatory. One publisher suggested she rewrite the material as moral fiction to soften its impact, but Kramer refused. Instead, she continued her research privately, traveling to Arkansas and Missouri, interviewing women who remembered Sarah. One elderly woman in Fort Smith told her, "She showed us where to strike so we could live, not where to hate." She said surviving was the loudest kind of rebellion. These oral histories convinced Kramer that Sarah's story was not legend but fact. She began to trace court archives and property ledgers, finding 3 overlapping trials that matched the accounts: the Wickham, Sheffield, and Drummond cases. The details aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. Kramer realized she had rediscovered a piece of history deliberately buried. In 1882, she finally published a small monograph titled Testimony of the Invisible, printing it herself after every publisher rejected it. The book received little attention at first, circulating quietly among academics and church libraries, but within a few years it reached reformers in Boston and Philadelphia who were searching for examples of black women's agency before emancipation. They were astonished. In an era when most historical writing portrayed enslaved women as silent victims, Sarah Granger's story emerged as something entirely different, an act of resistance that combined intellect, moral clarity, and physical defiance. Feminist scholars began citing her in lectures, using her life as proof that courage could exist even within total captivity. By the late 1880s, newspapers in the North were publishing serialized retellings of her trials, often romanticized or exaggerated but still carrying the essence of her truth. Meanwhile, the South reacted with fury. Former slaveholders denounced the story as fiction, claiming no such woman had ever existed. Clergymen preached sermons warning that glorifying her name encouraged rebellion among servants and bred disrespect for divine order. Yet every attempt to erase her only made her legend stronger. Students in newly founded black schools began reading Kramer's book in secret, copying her letters by hand, memorizing the words she had spoken in court. "I regret that it was necessary." One line read, "But I do not regret defending myself." That sentence appeared carved into desks, written on chalkboards, even embroidered into quilts passed down through generations. Without anyone planning it, Sarah Granger became a symbol of endurance, a quiet fire that burned beneath the surface of history. By the 1890s, historians began to acknowledge her as a real figure. Court archives were re-examined, confirming her trials and imprisonment. The newspapers that once called her a monster now referred to her as the woman who spoke before the law. Scholars debated her morality, her motives, even her sanity, but none could deny her influence. She had forced the American legal system to confront something it was never built to see: the humanity of the enslaved woman who refused to accept her fate. In 1898, at the first National Conference on Women's History held in New York, Kramer's research was finally presented publicly. The hall fell silent as she read Sarah's own words aloud, the ones taken from her third trial. "They call it rebellion. I call it remembering who we are." That moment marked the beginning of Sarah's slow resurrection in the written record. Yet even as her name began to appear in journals and books, much of her life remained obscured by myth. No one knew what she truly looked like, how her voice sounded, or where her grave lay beneath the weeds at Fort Leavenworth. What survived were her words, those carefully written letters, those precise, unflinching testimonies that refused to fade. They were enough. Through them, she became larger than any single story, a bridge between silence and speech, between bondage and selfhood. By the turn of the 20th century, school teachers across the Midwest were quietly using her story as a lesson in courage. In classrooms where her name was never officially allowed, they told her story anyway, beginning as the women in Fort Gibson once had. With a whisper and a promise, the work continues. By the dawn of the 20th century, Sarah Granger's name had crossed from whispered legend into the printed page, but history still treated her as a curiosity. an odd story from a darker age, half myth, half morality tale. It would take another 100 years for the world to finally understand the weight of what she had done. When the civil rights movements began to rise in the 1950s and 60s, activists searching through old archives stumbled upon her name again, buried in the footnotes of Lillian Kramer's forgotten monograph. For the young women leading protests in Montgomery and Birmingham, Sarah's defiance felt familiar. They saw in her not just a story of one woman's resistance, but the blueprint of their own fight. The same courage, the same demand for dignity, the same refusal to be silent. Her words began to appear again, scrawled on protest signs, quoted in pamphlets, repeated in speeches. They call it rebellion. I call it remembering who we are. By the 1970s, historians began to reclaim her story with the seriousness it had always deserved. University scholars traced the surviving fragments of her letters, uncovering entire collections that had survived in private family trunks and church basements. They pieced together her trials from court ledgers, cross-referenced testimonies, and discovered that nearly every word of Kramer's account had been true. What had once been dismissed as legend was now historical fact. In 1976, the University of Arkansas published the Sarah Granger Papers, a 2-volume collection of transcribed letters and trial documents. For the first time, her full voice was heard again, clear, precise, unbroken by time. Readers were stunned by the intelligence and control of her writing. She spoke not in anger but in clarity, describing injustice as though she were dissecting a sickness. One reviewer wrote, Sarah Granger understood, long before the law admitted it, that justice cannot belong only to those who hold power. She forced the world to look at itself and ask what punishment means when the crime is survival. In the decades that followed, artists and writers turned her life into poetry, theater, and film. Her name became a touchstone for conversations about autonomy, consent, and the history of resistance. Feminist movements of the late 20th century embraced her as a symbol of what it meant to fight quietly, but absolutely, to claim ownership of one's body, even in the face of systems designed to erase it. Her story began appearing in textbooks, not as an aside but as a turning point. A woman who challenged the legal, moral, and cultural foundations of slavery itself. For the descendants of those who had once whispered her name, seeing it printed on a page felt like justice arriving a century too late, but still powerful enough to matter. In 1992, a team of historians and archaeologists from the University of Kansas began an excavation at the old Fort Leavenworth Cemetery. Records indicated that grave number 1008, 158-1, 117, belonged to an unnamed female prisoner who had died of pneumonia that December. Beneath the frozen soil, they found what remained: a wooden marker collapsed into dust, a single rusted button from a prison dress, and a fragment of paper sealed in glass, too faint to read but bearing the initials S.G. It was enough to confirm what had long been believed. In 1994, a granite headstone was finally placed at the site. It bore no dates, no titles, only the words that had defined her. The work continues. Today, Sarah Granger's name stands among those who reshaped the moral imagination of a nation. Scholars call her the first recorded woman in American history to win acquittal in a self-defense case against her enslaver. Lawyers cite her as an early challenge to laws that denied personhood to the enslaved. And women, black, white, and beyond, speak her name as part of the long chain of those who refused to accept the world as it was given to them. Her story, once hidden in shadows, now appears in museums, lectures, and classrooms where students learn that courage is not born from strength but from necessity. No one knows what Sarah might have thought of the world she helped shape. Perhaps she would have smiled to see her words carried farther than she ever imagined. Perhaps she would have remained silent, knowing that survival was never about glory. Yet in every retelling, in every whisper that keeps her memory alive, there is the echo of the same promise she left behind: A promise that even when the body falls, the truth endures. And so her story ends as it began, not with triumph or tragedy, but with an unbroken vow spoken softly across time, still alive in the mouths of those who remember. The work continues.